All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the life of El Chapo
Oh, wow.
and the Sinaloa Cartel.
Okay.
And I have this biography here as
Yeah.
source material that you've provided.
Yes.
And it looks fascinating, to say the least.
It is.
We're really trying to understand not just who El Chapo was,
Right.
but how did this kid
Yeah.
from rural Mexico build a billion-dollar criminal empire?
Mm-hmm.
What was the impact of that, and what does it all mean? So buckle up, because we're talking about a journey from poverty to kingpin status, elaborate escapes, and an impact that's been felt on multiple continents.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. You know, I think one of the things that's fascinating about this story is that it's not just about one man. It's really a story about poverty and corruption and the global hunger for drugs. Right?
Yeah.
And so by looking at his life, we can really see the mechanics of the drug trade and the profound effects it has on society as a whole.
Yeah, and to think it all began in this small village in Sinaloa called La Tuna. Can you imagine growing up surrounded by poverty with opium poppy fields as just like a common sight?
It's hard to fathom.
Yeah, and by the age of 15, El Chapo, whose real name is Joaquín Guzmán was already involved in the drug trade to help his family. That's the reality for many in that region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to understand the socioeconomic landscape of Sinaloa.
Right.
You know, there's lack of opportunity, a long history of drug cultivation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a recipe, sadly, that leads many young people to view joining a cartel as the only way out.
Yeah.
And this is, sadly, we see this all around the world. Yeah. Think about poverty-stricken regions in Asia or conflict zones in Africa. It's the same factors that fuel the drug trade.
The global
phenomenon.
It really is, yeah.
It's this cycle it's hard to break.
It is.
But here's the thing. El Chapo, even in that world, he wasn't just another face in the crowd.
He had a drive.
Oh, yeah.
An ambition that kind of set him apart. And he ended up joining forces with Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo,
The Godfather.
the infamous head of the Guadalajara cartel, often referred to as the Godfather.
Exactly.
Talk about an intense mentorship program.
That partnership was pivotal for his rise. I mean, Felix Gallardo was a master strategist, and under his guidance, El Chapo really learned from the best.
Yeah.
You know, what I find remarkable, though, is El Chapo's business sense.
Yeah.
Even in that illicit world of drug trafficking,
Right.
he had a real knack for logistics, building networks for operating with brutal efficiency.
It sounds like ambition was practically hardwired into him.
Oh, absolutely.
And when the Guadalajara cartel fragmented, El Chapo didn't just, sit there and watch. He seized the opportunity.
Yeah.
And that's how the Sinaloa cartel was born.
Cartels they're complex entities, right?
Yeah.
They operate in this world of constantly shifting alliances, power grabs, and betrayals. And El Chapo was really a master at navigating these dynamics, always understanding that controlling territory and supply chains was key.
He wasn't just like a brute force kind of guy.
No, not at all.
We hear about these elaborate tunnels,
Right.
sophisticated smuggling routes. I mean, he was moving massive quantities of drugs across borders, operating like a criminal mastermind out of like a movie.
I know. It was incredible. The logistical skills were just amazing.
Yeah.
To give you some perspective, imagine a company like Amazon or FedEx.
Yeah.
But instead of delivering packages, they're trafficking cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines
Wow.
across continents, generating billions of dollars in revenue. I mean, that was the scale of the Sinaloa cartel's operations under El Chapo.
It's almost too big to grasp.
I know, right?
And of course, he wasn't a one-man show. There were other major figures
Of course.
involved, like Ismael El Mayo Zambada, his trusted right-hand man, and Hector Luis Eldoro Palma Salazar, another key associate.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And each one of these individuals brought something unique to the table.
Right.
Zambada, for instance, known for his strategic thinking and his knack for diplomacy. He was really responsible for maintaining relationships and making sure that, that intricate machine of the cartel kept running.
But let's not forget the other side of this story, the devastating impact of the cartel's activities.
Yeah.
Mexico bore the brunt of it. This flood of drug money created a shadow economy, fueled rampant violence and corruption that seeped into every corner of society.
It's a heartbreaking reality.
It is.
And the consequences are far-reaching.
Yeah.
You have the erosion of law and order, you have the disintegration of trust in institutions,
right.
and of course the immense human cost.
Yeah.
Imagine, entire communities living in a constant state of fear,
right.
caught in the crossfire of these cartel wars. It was really a breakdown of the very fabric of society.
And that impact extended far beyond Mexico's borders.
Oh, absolutely.
The Sinaloa Cartel became a main supplier of drugs to the United States, directly contributing to the opioid crisis that has had such devastating consequences.
A crucial point, because the flow of cheap heroin and fentanyl from the Sinaloa Cartel flooded the U.S., creating a public health emergency on a massive scale. And it also kind of exposes the shortcomings, in my opinion, of the war on drugs.
Right.
Despite billions of dollars spent, it's largely failed to curb drug trafficking.
Yeah.
Some would argue that it's actually made the situation worse.
It's this multifaceted problem with no easy solutions. Then there's El Chapo himself.
Right.
A man who became almost like a legend for his ability to evade capture.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he was first captured in 1993, but escaped in 2001, reportedly by hiding in a laundry cart.
I know. Can you imagine?
Talk about audacious.
Unbelievable.
Then he was recaptured in 2014, only to escape again in 2015 through a mile-long tunnel dug right under his prison cell.
Unbelievable.
To understand the audacity of these escapes, you have to think about the logistics involved.
I know.
This wasn't just digging a hole in the ground. This was a feat of engineering.
Oh, yeah.
Requiring detailed planning, resources, a network of collaborators, both inside and outside the prison. It highlights the extent of the cartel's power and the level of corruption that made these escapes possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a testament to their reach and their influence. I mean, this was a force that could seemingly bend even the strongest institutions to its will.
It's mind-blowing. And, those escapes certainly bolstered his image as some sort of folk hero, even with all the suffering he caused.
It's a complicated legacy.
It is.
Right. These escapes are almost mythical in their daring, but they also point to the very real consequences of the cartel's power and influence.
His run finally ended in 2016 when he was captured and extradited to the U.S.
Right.
But, with El Chapo behind bars, the Sinaloa Cartel didn't just disappear.
No, not at all.
Reports suggest it continues to operate, possibly under the leadership of Zambada and El Chapo's sons.
And this speaks to a key characteristic of the drug trade.
Yeah.
It's cyclical. Taking down one leader, even one as notorious as El Chapo, rarely solves the problem.
Right.
New players emerge, violence escalates, and the cycle starts anew. This constant struggle for power and control is really at the heart of how these cartels operate.
So where do we go from here? What can be done to disrupt this seemingly endless cycle?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What if instead of spending billions on enforcement, we shifted our focus to prevention and rehabilitation? That's a question that our source material actually explores.
Right.
Imagine a world where the resources that we currently dedicate to capturing these drug lords and intercepting shipments are instead invested in preventing drug use in the first place and providing treatment and support to those struggling with addiction.
It's a thought-provoking idea. It makes you wonder if the war on drugs has been the right approach all along.
Right.
Maybe it's time to consider a different path, one that focuses on treating addiction as a public health issue rather than a criminal one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from El Chapo's life and the legacy of the Sinaloa Cartel is that solutions to complex problems like the drug trade require us to question our assumptions and consider alternative approaches, however radical they may seem.
It's clear we need to move beyond the simplistic narratives of good versus evil.
Absolutely.
And delve into these underlying complexities of this global issue.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
We need to be willing to challenge the status quo and have these open and honest conversations about how we can create a world where the cycle of drug-related violence and suffering is finally broken.
Yeah, and this is just the beginning of our exploration. We'll be back with part 2 to delve deeper into these alternative approaches and examine what a real shift in drug policy might look like. So stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
Dear listener, please check the message and the links in the description. And before we continue with the podcast, may I ask you to subscribe, write a comment, and share. Thank you, and enjoy.
Welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive into El Chapo, the Sinaloa Cartel, and the complex world of the drug trade. In the last part, we talked about shifting away from the war on drugs towards like a public health focused approach. Right. And one alternative that I think was mentioned in the source material is harm reduction. Mm-hmm. Can you explain exactly what that means and how it might apply to this situation?
Well, harm reduction is really a pragmatic approach. It acknowledges that drug use exists.
Right.
And it focuses on mitigating the negative consequences rather than just aiming for complete abstinence.
Right.
It prioritizes public health and safety above all else.
So it's not about pretending drug use doesn't happen, but more like, how do we make it less damaging?
It's exactly.
Which seems more realistic given how persistent the demand for drugs is.
Absolutely. And harm reduction encompasses a variety of strategies.
Yeah.
For example, needle exchange programs.
Right.
To prevent HIV and Hep C transmission, providing access to drug testing kits so users can identify dangerous substances like fentanyl.
Right.
And even establishing safe consumption sites where individuals can use drugs under medical supervision.
That all makes sense. Those are all practical steps that could potentially save lives.
They are.
But wouldn't some people view this as enabling drug use, like sending the wrong message?
I mean, it's a common concern.
Right.
But I think it stems from a misunderstanding of what harm reduction is really trying to achieve.
Yeah.
It's not about condoning or encouraging drug use at all.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that people who use drugs are still human beings,
right,
deserving of care and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And by reducing those harms associated with drug use, we can actually help individuals make positive changes in their lives.
I see what you mean. It's similar to how we handle other public health issues, like smoking or excessive alcohol consumption.
Exactly.
We don't tell people to just quit cold turkey, right?
No.
We offer resources and support to help them manage their behavior and minimize risks.
Precisely. And the evidence really does suggest that harm reduction works.
Yeah.
Countries like Switzerland and the Netherlands, which have implemented these strategies, have actually seen reductions in drug-related deaths, HIV infections, and even crime rates.
That's good. That's encouraging.
Yeah.
But to implement such a drastically different approach,
right,
wouldn't we need a massive shift in public opinion and political will?
Absolutely. It requires us to move away from this moral judgment that often surrounds drug use,
right,
and embrace a more evidence-based public health perspective.
Right.
We need to dismantle the stigma associated with addiction, which prevents people from seeking help.
So changing laws isn't enough. We need to change heart and minds as well.
Exactly. We need to create a more compassionate and supportive environment for people who use drugs and those struggling with addiction.
Right.
And this means investing in robust treatment and recovery programs, creating pathways for reintegration into society.
This makes me think about all the money that's been poured into the war on drugs over the decades.
Right.
What if those resources had been used differently?
It's a question.
What if prevention, education, harm reduction had been the priority from the start?
Right. That's the hypothetical scenario that our source material presents, right?
Yeah.
A world where the focus shifts from punishment to prevention, from criminalization to rehabilitation. Just imagine the potential impact that could have had on public health, safety, and the well-being of communities.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if we've been tackling this problem from the wrong angle all along.
Well, it's certainly a valid question to ask.
Yeah.
I think the key here is that it's not just about redirecting funds. It's about a fundamental shift in our thinking.
Right.
Instead of just viewing drug use solely through the lens of criminal justice, we need to start seeing it as a public health challenge that requires a comprehensive and compassionate response.
This brings us back to El Chapo's story.
Right.
His rise and the devastating consequences of the drug trade really highlight the failures of the approach we've been taking for decades.
El Chapo's story kind of acts as this microcosm of the larger systemic issues at play. It really shines a light on the interconnected nature of, poverty, corruption, and this demand for drugs.
Right.
And I think it also demonstrates how the war on drugs, with its emphasis on interdiction and incarceration, really hasn't addressed those underlying causes of the problem.
So what's the next step? What lessons can we take away from El Chapo's legacy and, the persistent challenges of the drug trade?
I think there are a few key takeaways here. First, I think it's really important to acknowledge the sheer complexity of this issue.
Okay.
There are no easy solutions. And clinging to, like, these simplistic good versus evil narratives, I think, really hinders our understanding.
Mm-hmm. The second, we need to move beyond the failed policies of the past.
Yes.
And embrace an approach that prioritizes public health and is grounded in, like, scientific evidence.
Absolutely. And third, I think investing in, prevention, education, and these harm reduction strategies is critical.
Right.
This includes, providing resources for treatment and recovery, supporting communities that are heavily impacted by drug use, and really tackling the socioeconomic factors that contribute to the problem in the first place.
And finally, we have to have the courage to challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Be open to considering new approaches, even if they seem radical or unconventional at first.
Exactly. And that requires us to, engage in open dialogue, cultivate critical thinking, and really learn from the experiences of other countries that have successfully implemented, alternative drug policies.
Yeah. It's a daunting task.
It is.
But the human cost of inaction is, I think, too high to ignore.
I agree.
We can't afford to stay on the same path.
I think, what it comes down to is recognizing our shared humanity.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And understanding that finding solutions to these complex challenges requires a collective effort.
Yeah.
We owe it to ourselves, our communities, and, future generations to find a more just, compassionate, and sustainable path forward.
Those are some powerful ideas. What would that path look like in practice, though? In Part 3, we'll explore specific policy proposals and consider what real lasting change might entail. So stay with us.
Dear listener, please check the message and the links in the description. And before we continue with the podcast, may I ask you to subscribe, write a comment, and share. Thank you, and enjoy.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of El Chapo and the Sinaloa Cartel, and it's been a fascinating journey so far.
It has.
We've covered his rise to power, explored the intricate workings of the cartel, examined the far-reaching consequences of the drug trade.
Right.
But most importantly, we started to consider, what alternative approaches might look like. So now I think it's time to maybe shift gears a little bit and get into some, like, nitty-gritty about potential solutions.
Yeah.
You've provided some really intriguing source material that hints at various possibilities.
Right.
So if you were in charge of drug policy,
oh, wow,
what concrete actions would you prioritize to tackle this complex issue?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
If I could enact just one change, it would be to redirect resources away from that traditional war on drugs model.
Okay.
And invest heavily in a public health approach.
Okay.
So that means prioritizing, prevention, education, treatment, harm reduction strategies.
So less emphasis on border security and capturing kingpins and more on, like, understanding and addressing the root causes of drug use and addiction.
I think that's key.
You've mentioned Portugal's decriminalization model before.
Yes.
And it's something that the source material highlights as a potential example. Can you remind us how that policy has actually played out for them?
Sure. So back in 2001, Portugal made this bold decision to decriminalize all drugs.
Wow.
Now, it's important to note, they didn't legalize them.
Right.
What they did was shift their entire approach to treating drug use as a public health concern.
Right.
And this meant investing in harm reduction programs, expanding access to treatment, and focusing on reintegrating people who use drugs back into society.
It sounds like a pretty radical shift.
It was. It was a big change.
What impact has it had?
Well, the results have been overwhelmingly positive.
Okay.
They've seen significant decreases in drug-related deaths, HIV infections, crime rates have gone down.
That's good.
But perhaps even more importantly, more people are actually seeking treatment for drug addiction.
Those are really impressive outcomes.
They are.
But would a model like that be feasible in, places like Mexico or the U.S. where the drug trade is so deeply ingrained?
Yeah, it's a valid question.
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
Any policy shift would need to be adapted to the specific context and challenges of each country.
Yeah.
However, Portugal's success really does demonstrate that a public health approach can be incredibly effective.
I think one of the main arguments against decriminalization is that it would lead to an increase in drug use.
Yeah.
How do you address that concern?
That's a common misconception.
Okay.
But the evidence from Portugal actually contradicts that fear.
Okay.
Drug use rates there have remained relatively stable since decriminalization.
Okay.
And in some cases, they've even decreased.
Wow. So it hasn't had that,
that
effect that people are so concerned about.
Yeah. And I think what has changed is that people are now more likely to seek help when they need it.
So by removing the stigma and the threat of criminal penalties, people feel safer reaching out for treatment and support.
Absolutely. Yeah. Decriminalization really fosters a more supportive environment where individuals who use drugs can access help without fear of judgment or punishment.
Makes sense, but what about the supply side of the equation? If we decriminalize drugs, wouldn't that just empower the cartels?
Well, that's where things get a little more complicated.
Yeah.
Decriminalization alone wouldn't completely dismantle the cartels.
Right.
We also need to find ways to disrupt the economic incentives that drive the drug trade.
So what are some potential strategies for tackling that side of the problem?
Well, there are a few possibilities worth exploring.
Okay.
One idea that's gaining traction is this concept of regulated markets for certain drugs.
Okay.
We've seen this with cannabis in some parts of the world.
So you're talking about legalizing and regulating the production and sale of currently illegal drugs.
Yes.
That would certainly be a controversial move.
It would be a significant shift.
What are the potential benefits?
Well, I think regulated markets could really help to undermine the power of the cartels.
Right.
By cutting into their profits.
Right.
They could also allow for quality control.
Right.
Ensuring that consumers aren't exposed to, dangerous substances or contaminants.
Those are some really compelling points.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that lead to, a whole new set of challenges? Increased addiction rates and public health risks?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I think regulations can be designed to mitigate those risks.
Okay.
We could implement, strict age limits, control potency levels,
right,
invest heavily in public education campaigns to inform people about the potential harms.
So it's about harm reduction, but on a societal level.
Exactly.
It seems like striking the right balance is key.
It is. It is.
How do we find that sweet spot where we reduce harm without unintentionally, encouraging drug use?
Right. It's a complex equation.
Yeah.
And there will always be strong opinions on both sides.
Right.
But I believe it's a conversation that we need to have openly and honestly.
Yeah.
The status quo clearly isn't working.
It's not.
And we need to explore these new and innovative solutions if we truly want to break the cycle of drug-related harm.
And that brings us back to the legacy of El Chapo.
Yeah.
What lessons can we learn from his story and, the demonstrable failures of the war on drugs?
Well, I think El Chapo's story is a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of prohibition.
Right.
Focusing solely on law enforcement, I think, often backfires.
Yeah.
Because it tends to strengthen these criminal organizations and just fuels more violence.
And it also underscores that, a deep-seated connection between the drug trade and issues like poverty, corruption, social inequality.
Absolutely. These are complex, interconnected problems.
Yeah.
And tackling the drug trade effectively demands, a multi-pronged approach that addresses these root causes.
Yeah.
It requires a fundamental shift in our mindset from punishment to prevention, from criminalization to compassion.
Yeah. It's been an incredibly insightful conversation.
It has.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what, key takeaways would you want our listeners to remember?
Well, I urge everyone listening to really educate themselves about the complexities of the drug trade, the potential for these alternative approaches, support organizations that are working on harm reduction and drug policy reform, engage in thoughtful conversations about these issues with, your friends, your family, your elected officials.
Yeah.
Your voice matters.
It does.
It's about recognizing the shared humanity of those who use drugs and advocating for policies that prioritize public health and human rights over, punishment and prohibition.
Absolutely. It's a powerful message to end on.
It is.
Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into the world of El Chapo and the Sinaloa Cartel.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
It's been a very thought-provoking exploration of a very challenging issue.
It has.
The pleasure was all mine.
Thank you.
And, remember, knowledge is power.
It is.
The more we understand about these issues,
Absolutely.
the better equipped we are to contribute to positive change.
I agree.
And on that note, this concludes our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Dear listener, thank you for being with us all the way. Hopefully you found the discussion interesting. Bonnie and Clyde, that's what they call themselves, our research journalists, continue to dive equally into the story and in modern times, according to interesting material, and make it to marrow. You can know that your opinion is of great importance to us, and also tips on issues that you want us to do. It weighs each of you to write a tip in the comment below, or even send us an email. Until then, take good care of yourself and your loved ones.
From the mountains of Sinaloa, a boy was born with dreams of power and a heart so worn. No silver spoon, just a life of toil. In the fields of poppy, he began to boil. He built an empire, one brick at a time, climbing the ladder, leaving morals behind. The world was his canvas, the blood was his paint. With every move, his soul began to faint. Oh, El Chapo, with the world at your feet, the fortune you gather, the lives you defeat. In the darkness you thrive, where the shadows can't reach. But the cost of your rise is a lesson to teach. He smuggled the goods through tunnels and plains. His fortune grew fast while he tightened the chains. The streets were his kingdom, the cartels his crown, but the thirst for power never let him down. He fought for control, he fought for the prize, but the ghosts in the night, they don't wear disguise. The money and fame, they blinded his eyes, while the world around him crumbled in lies. Oh, El Chapo, with the world at your feet, the fortune you gather, the lives you defeat. In the darkness you thrive, where the shadows can't reach. But the cost of your rise is a lesson to teach. He ran from the law, through the prison walls, a man of the shadows who never recalls. But deep in his heart, where the hunger lies, he could never outrun his own disguise. The wealth, the power, it turned him cold, but the price of a soul is a price untold. And now as he falls, what's left to be won? A life of regrets and nowhere to run. Oh, El Chapo, with the world at your feet, the fortune you gather, the lives you defeat. In the darkness you thrive, where the shadows can't reach. But the cost of your rise is a lesson to teach. He ran from the law, through the prison walls, a man of the shadows who never recalls. But deep in his heart, where the hunger lies, he could never outrun his own disguise. The wealth, the power, it turned him cold, but the price of a soul is a price untold. And now as he falls, what's left to be won? A life of regrets and nowhere to run. Oh, El Chapo, with the world at your feet, the fortune you gather, the lives you defeat. In the darkness you thrive, where the shadows can't reach. But the cost of your rise is a lesson to teach. So remember the story of the man who flew high, for the higher you soar, the harder you'll die. El Chapo's empire may crumble and fall, but in the end, it's the heart that pays for it all.